Let's take a closer look at how the interactability works. In this scene, I've already set up my character, I have the moving platform set up, and I also have a couple of objects that the character is going to interact with. This first object is the one that we're going to be focusing on, which is this button, and when the button is pressed, we're going to want the moving platform to start. So just to see what we're working with, let's go ahead and hit play. And you can see when the game starts, the moving platform moves. If I go to the button and I press the action key, which is mapped to the F key, there's no interaction at all. And all of this makes sense because we haven't set up anything related to interact yet. So let's go ahead and start setting it up by first clicking on the moving platform and then going to enable on interact and enabling that. What this will do is it will prevent the moving platform from moving until it's interacted with. So you can see I just hit play and the moving platform is not moving at all. So that's good. There are a couple of different pieces to the interactability, and the first thing is the actual ability. So let's go ahead and add that. We can do that by going to the ultimate character locomotion component, go into the ability list, and then hitting interact or adding interact. And we're going to leave all these values at the default right now just to get the basics working. And we're going to go back to this interact button since this is the object that we want the character to interact with. And we are going to add the interactable component. The interact ability on the character works with the interactable component on the actual interact object. This component then reaches out to all of its targets to determine if it can actually interact with that object. So there's three layers to it. There's the interactability, there's this interactable component, and then there's these targets, which, if you're familiar with scripting, are interfaces that implement the interactable target interface. So let's go ahead and add one object right now. And the one object that we want the character to interact with is this platform. And the platform implements the interactable target interface. So that allows us to successfully set this. So now when I hit play, it actually still wouldn't do anything because there are no triggers for the character to interact with. So let me go ahead and add a box collider, and I'm going to make this a trigger, and I'm going to cheat real quick just to look at how the demo scene is set up so that I can use similar values for that box collider. So I have those values right here. Alright, so now that trigger is set up, and the last thing that we need to do is go back to the interactability, and right now it's detecting the object using a character cast while we want it to detect the object using a trigger. So now when we hit play and I go to the button and I'm within the trigger right now and I press the F key, we can see that the moving platform does start. There's still a couple of issues in that the button doesn't actually get pressed and no animation plays, but we're making progress. So let's go ahead and set the rest up, or at least some of the rest, and let's add a new component called the animated interactable component. And what this does is it's just a small component which has a variety of parameters. I actually think this is a demo scene only component, but we can use it here. And the one parameter that I need to adjust is to play this press, or is to enable the trigger, the press trigger when it's interacted with. And this is just specific to how the interact button is set up, so it's really no big deal. So now when the interactable component is interacted with, it will interact with both the platform and also this interact button. And the other thing that we need to do is, well, actually let's go ahead and hit play. We'll see that we made a baby step, and that look at the button, and you can see when I interact, the button is pressed. There's no animations that play with that, and that's because the interactability, if we go to it, we can see that it has a ability index parameter of 9, but under the actual interaction, or the actual interact substate on the upper body layer. There are no transitions that exist just with an index of 9 and an ability int data value of 0. You can see that this press button state, it has ability int data of 1. And so on the interactability, let's go back to the character, and we'll see that this int data value should be set to 1. Now, if you haven't seen the animator controller video yet, I highly recommend you do so, because this explains how these different parameters work. So now when I hit play, we should see that the character tries to press the button. So that started, so that's good. However, the character doesn't move into the correct position, because you can see, actually let me go ahead and let's look completely the other way. As long as I'm within the trigger, I should be able to interact. So the interactability is working fine, it just needs to start when the character is looking at the correct position or is in the correct location. We can do that by adding this move towards location component, and what this will do is it will draw a little gizmo that shows the location that the character will move towards before the interactability can start. I actually want to modify this just a little bit so it's closer, and now when I hit play, we should see that the character tries to move into position when I start interacting. So the character moved into position, but there was a camera pop. And the reason for that is that the move towards ability, it will time out if it doesn't notice any significant movement. And in this case, you can see that the character successfully moved its position to that ability start location, except the rotation was wrong. So that's why it did that teleportation. And the reason why the rotation wasn't really moving was because this motor rotation speed is set to an extremely small value for the move towards ability. So we can fix that by using the state system to activate the move towards state. And when this state is active, we are going to have this new preset, which is the move towards preset. And then this preset is active, it will set this rotation speed to a much higher value. If you haven't watched the state system video yet, you should do so, as the state system is extremely useful. So now when I go within that trigger and I press the F button, we should see that he rotates at a normal speed as well. So that worked well. There wasn't any teleportation either. So we're doing well there. That's it for this button interactability. But now I want to go to the chest, and I want an animation to play similar to how the button animation is playing, but I also want a new a new target to play, just to show you how easy it is to create new interactable targets. And this just kind of opens up the full potential in that you can really interact with any sort of object, just whatever you want within your game. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to add another interactability. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to specify which ability is what, so that we don't get confused. So the description, it has button, and now we will add a new one, and we will call this one chest. So the button and chest interact abilities have been set up. However, there's not necessarily one way right now to differentiate between the two. Like, how does it know that the button interact animation should play right here, whereas the chest interact animation should play here? And it does that through this interactable ID value. You can see on this button, under the interactable component, there's this ID, and we want that ID to match with the ability. So let's specify a 1 for a button. And we do it right here, not 10, 1. And then chest, we're gonna use a value of 2. So let me go to the chest, and we haven't set up the chest at all yet. So let's go ahead and just start setting that up. Let me see what values we used for the box collider. And this chest is going to be set up a little bit differently in that instead of a trigger starting it, we're going to use the regular capsule cast. The capsule cast is basically a fancy way of saying cast using the colliders of the character. So in this case, it has a capsule collider. So the character cast will be doing a cast in using the capsule. It's basically just like a fat ray cast in this case. So let's go to the character cast, or I set that value to, or I added the box collider. Let me add the interactable component now and make sure I specify an ID of 2. So now we go back to Nolan, and we need to modify a little bit of these character cast settings, and just to make it work a little bit better for our particular situation. So now when I go, let's add this ability message. So let's say press F to interact. So now we'll be able to see when we can interact with the chest, and we'll do the same thing with the button. So now let's hit play, and just to make sure we didn't mess anything up, okay, we can see that we're getting an error, and I know what that error is, and it's okay for right now. We can see that this new message appears, and when I press F, it's going to play the button one. If I go and press or if I go to the chest, you can see we're getting some problems, so let's fix that. And the reason for all these problems is because there are no interactable targets set up. So let's go ahead and add one. And similar to the button, we're going to use the animated interactable component as the first target. And this one has a slightly different set of parameters. So let's go ahead and set those. I'm just looking at the demo scene in this case. So now when I go and I try to interact with the chest, first off, I shouldn't get any errors, so that's good. And now it says press F to interact. And so let's press F to interact, and we can see that the chest opened, but the ability, or the character didn't start in the right position. So we can adjust that by specifying the move towards location similar to the button. And we want the angle to be a little bit wider. You'll notice the gizmo, it turns a little bit greener right here. And what this does is it specifies the threshold for how wide of an angle is acceptable that the character can move towards. So we just want that value. And now let's go ahead and hit play. And let's interact. He moves in the correct position, but his animation's a little bit short. And I think the reason for that is we're waiting on the run events. Yeah, the reason for that is that we're waiting on the run events. So right now we're based on timers, but we instead want the interact event and the interact complete event to be based on an animation event. So let's go ahead and hit play now. So now if I press F to interact, we should see the full animation play. So that looked better. He's a little bit far away, so we could adjust that ability start location. So I think, what value do we use? On the chest we use, let's see, we use a value of 0.84. So this will move the character up a little bit further. So nothing here is really too new compared to the button. It's just we're about to get to the new stuff. So yeah, that looks a little bit better. He's probably still a little far away, but I mean that works for our purposes. So the last thing that we want to do is let's create a new interactable target, and this interactable target will play when the chest animation, or when the chest interactability starts. Actually, technically the interact occurs after this interact event occurs. And right now we're waiting for the animation event. So an animation event is sent to the interactability to actually do the interaction. And this will just allow you to wait a moment before actually doing the interaction or telling the object to be interacted with. And it, for example, allows your animation to play to actually press the button instead of it starting right when the interactability starts. But let's go ahead and see that I've created a new script that's about as basic as you can get. It's just a simple mono behavior. And we are going to add that mono behavior to the chest. And we are going to specify a new target. And right now, if I were to hit play, I would get an error because that target doesn't implement the correct interface. So let's go ahead and implement that interface. So the first thing that we want to do is include the correct namespace. And then we also want to add the interactable target name or interface. And you can see we're getting an error right now because it doesn't implement a couple of members. So let's go ahead and implement those. And the two methods that we need to implement are can interact and interact. So it's a really simple interface that we need to implement. And can interact specifies true or false if the character can interact with the object. And we are always going to want the character to be able to interact with the object in this case. So we're going to return true. And then interact occurs when the character actually interacts with the object. And in this case, this is where you do all your custom code for interacting or for interfacing with your own game. So in this case, we're just going to output to the log just so you can see that it works. Actually, we'll do interact did because we did interact. And now when we go back, we hit play, we should see that let's see, that doesn't look like any sort of our error. That looks something within Unity, but let's clear that out. So now when we go, I made that small, but that's whatever. So now when we interact, we should see a message being outputted to the log. So our new message worked. And that's how you set up the interactability.